Hey, Dan, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, do people want to see me, or is it best just to leave it with the
This
slides?
is totally fine. We don't have to do
Okay.
your video on, yeah, because sometimes you get interrupted, so you'll be okay.
Yeah, I put a note on my door.
So we are live, so people are joining us. We are recording. I'm just giving them, a minute or so to come in before we start. There's usually between about 100, 120 people. So hopefully we'll let them start coming in, and then I'm going to launch it in just a minute. So if you're joining us, we are going live in about 1 minute. So please be patient. All right, thanks everybody for joining us. We're very excited today to have Beverly Rogers to talk to us about assessment audits and focus on some cases. She's going to do a handful of cases today with a little bit of additional content, which should be very exciting. Just a reminder that each week we will send, or before each session, we will send out the registration email, which has some registration questions, and that includes the link as well as any attachments that you would need for that case discussion. So please make sure you look for that link every time and follow that link to do that. If you have questions during the session, please use the Q&A box to the bottom right of your screen, and our monitors in the background will prepare those questions for Dr. Rogers when she gets to a point for questions. If you're having a technical problem, please use the chat box, which is down to the left, and our team will follow along and help you if you have an issue. All of the recorded sessions prior to today are available on the landing page, which was in that first email, and it's in all your registration emails. And that landing page now has live links that you can go to, even if you haven't, even if you didn't register for that particular session. So those are now publicly available to everyone. So we will be sending out a reminder email about that. So with that, and today Dr. Rogers is going to be using polling. So we have a handful of polling questions, so please get ready to answer those as they pop up. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rogers.
Thanks so much. And it's really good to be with you all. I would say this morning, this afternoon, or this evening. It depends on where we all are. We're going to spend some time today just on the practical aspects of audits. I put this first slide here just to say that the word assessment as used in this context is the same as an audit, but I will be referring to these as audits. That's just the term that I'm used to using. I think it's so important, to have a good foundation related to the ability to audit your operation. It is one of the cornerstones of quality and hardwiring quality. And what I'm going to do today is share some cases. Honestly, they are to some degree fabricated, but also in large part issues that I've experienced in my laboratory, and essentially some of the things we did to correct the issues. I've never been to Africa, and I would love to go to Africa, but as we know, people aren't traveling a whole lot one way or the other right now. I'm the Chief of Pathology at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta in Atlanta, Georgia in the United States. Have been here for almost 11 years in that capacity. Before that, spent many years as Chief of Pathology at Children's Medical Center in Dallas, Texas in the U.S., and really have spent all of my life in pediatric laboratory and pathology medicine. I am board certified in anatomic and clinical pathology, but also subspecialty in pediatric pathology which to my knowledge is unique in having a board subspecialty to the United States, although I've had the wonderful opportunity to meet many folks across the world, because there are certifications in other countries that you can attain in different ways, and that's by lectures and training in that area. But I did want to introduce you to my view of Africa that I see every day. And in these two photos is my administrative director, who is my partner. She and I work hand in hand every day on the phone multiple times a day in each other's offices. Her name is Francine Uwandadwa. She was born in Rwanda, and she is the administrative director of the laboratories at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. And she is a truly rare person. And then Maria Tuwe, who was raised in Zimbabwe. I have the pleasure of having her office about 2 down from me on the campus where I currently am, and she's our Laboratory Information Systems Manager. So I wanted to introduce you to 2 of the people who I know and work with very closely from the continent of Africa. I went back to the ISO 15189 criteria regulations and pulled just one of the sound bites from there, if you will, one of the areas that basically says the purpose of an audit. And I really liked this, so I wanted to share it. Some of the things you're going to be seeing, you've seen before in the lecture on audits and in different capacities. So hopefully this will just reinforce some of what you've heard already. But the verbiage goes, the laboratory shall plan and implement the evaluation of internal audit processes needed to, and the first thing is demonstrate that the pre-examination, examination, and post-examination and supporting processes, and this is absolutely classic for lab medicine. You know, you can call it the pre-analytic, analytic, and post-analytic processes of actually having a lab result, a lab test thought by a clinician, I think I need to get a creatinine on this patient. I think they might be in renal failure. Have that order written, have it collected, have it transported to the laboratory, have it run, and then have it resulted by the laboratory, have that result get back to the clinician, and have the action taken for the patient. And that is the entire value stream, if you will, of the laboratory testing process. And it says that it needs to be conducted in a manner that meets the needs and requirements of the users. And I call this the value stream from lean terminology. My job here, I think, is to take care of the patients and be a resource, be a place where the user, be it the patient or the physician or the care provider, can get information they need to help care for their patient. So basically, I consider them all my customers and need to be treated in that manner of respect, of valuing their input, which I will tell you, sometimes you can get too much input and sometimes it can be frustrating. But at the same time, they are the customer. And so our job is to do the best we can with this laboratory testing value stream so that the patient can be cared for appropriately. The second bullet under the laboratory audit process is to ensure conformity to the quality management system. That is so important. It reminded me of one of my favorite sayings. I love a children's book called Horton Hatches the Egg. And this is Horton over here, and Horton is obviously an elephant. And this bird called Maisie talks Horton into sitting on the egg in her nest while she flies off and has a little vacation. And so Horton, at some point, realizes this is a big mistake, and he makes it through a winter. But what he says was, I meant what I said, and I said what I meant. And I think that is so important. And it's not just what we say is what we mean, but what we say is what we do. And I think that's incredibly important to laboratory medicine. And the last is the audits help us continually improve the effectiveness of the quality management system. You know, there are different ways that I have been inspected over the years, over the decades. And some inspectors come in and they want to know if you have a procedure and you follow it. And that's absolutely important. And that connotes number two, that others have said, well, okay, you have a procedure, you follow it, but is this procedure or is this test effective in helping to treat the patient? Are you effective at getting the results back to the clinician? Or do they just go somewhere and nobody ever sees them? So this is just a higher level of ensuring that what we do adds value to the patient care. And I call this improve on improving, which some, Peter Senge and others, call a learning organization. A learning organization is what I strive for every day, and it is the drive to keep learning every day more than you know the day before. So for these cases that we're going to go over, we're going to have a mixture of cases, and I'm going to focus on two general categories. The first is, you know, you can have audits that are external, and this is some sort of agency coming in to verify usually the quality of your laboratory services, or they can be internal, just what you do that makes you certain that you run a quality operation. External is very valuable because there are a standard set of rules and regulations, and if your laboratory or our laboratory can be compared to somebody else's. And so it's important when you're preparing for these external audits, external inspections, if you will, to actually ourselves do audits to determine if the laboratory meets defined standards. Internal, there can be an audit based on identified problems, an audit to assess compliance with critical regulations, and then an audit to ensure a change to fix a problem is sustained. There are probably other reasons to audit. These are the things that I see most commonly in my practice that are the reasons that we implement audits. I can tell you in our labs, we actually have a total of 8, 9, 10, 11 laboratories in Atlanta, and it's a system. And we liberally engage in an audit system and actually revamped our entire audit system about 4 years ago to increase the effectiveness of the system itself. So here's the first problem. You're a quality manager in your laboratory and you're getting ready for an external audit by the health department. So one of the areas you've heard that the health department focuses on is personnel records. And you know how sometimes, and this is a let's just say a variation on a true story from my time back in Dallas. And so you can get the kind of the underground information. You know, if somebody else has been inspected by the health department, and particularly a specific inspector, and you say, you know, you call up your friend and you say, hey, what they look at, and they say, wow, they really hit us on personnel. You know, you could. It's good to get the information if you can, any information you can. And so you're saying personnel, okay. And you want to ensure that your personnel records are compliant with the regulations of the health department. And this is where I go to the questions. So is somebody else going to read this?
I'm going to put up the polls now, Beverly. So just give me 1 second here. We're going to do the first poll.
Great.
So here we go. So you'll give about 1 minute to answer this question. The first step is to, and there are 4 options. Beverly, can you see the poll as well?
I can.
Okay, good. We usually go with about 1 minute of polling, or 50% of people have answered. It usually hits about the same. It's usually about that right number.
Sounds great.
All right. We are at 1 minute now. Okay. And can you see the results now?
I cannot.
Okay. Can you see them now?
Yes.
Okay. There you go.
And so, you know, this, what I can tell you is that none of these answers are right or wrong. They are simply my opinion of how I would go about it. And the majority said make a spreadsheet of items to audit. And clearly, you know, having a spreadsheet is extremely important, or having some sort of ability to document your data is extremely important when doing an audit. Ask your director what they would like to have audited. That may be a good idea if you're new to an organization and you know your director has a strong opinion about things. Identify, let's go to the last one. Identify which personnel records you will audit. There may be some you're more concerned about, and so maybe that's the first thing you would say. What I would do is find out what the health department will be assessing related to competency. And if we can close this, and I'll just
go ahead with your arrows. Yep.
Yeah, it's not going.
You're using the up or the down arrow.
Oh, okay. Got it. Thanks.
Yeah.
So what I need to tell you is that none of this is wrong. And there is all, you know, it's a choice of how you go about things. I'll share with you how I go about things. And it's probably at this point in my life that the first thing I do is I find out what the health department wants to know. Because I can say that there are things that are important to me, but if there are like 4 things the health department really wants to audit, and I don't focus on those, but I focus on a 5th one to the detriment of one of those 4 things, I'm going to get a citation. And sometimes if you get a citation, you spend so much time dealing with the citation and the issues from that you almost can't focus on what you really need to focus on. So the first thing I personally do is I find out what the question is. Okay, health department, what do you want to know? Where's your regulation? And that also is from my lens, because what I am used to working with is checklists that people give me, and they say, these are the things you're going to be inspected on. That may or may not be the truth with your individual health department. But I think the point is it's important to be systematic about what you're doing. It's important to have information about what you need to get, and it's what you need to audit, and what you're going to be inspected on, and it's important to have a very clear path to do that audit. So this is just an example of what the health department might require. And so they probably require a lot more than 4 items, but let's just say they want a list of all laboratory technical personnel. So they want to know who all your technical personnel are. It might be nice to put in your non-technical personnel, who is your support staff, et cetera. But the bottom line is they don't require it. So if you only have a certain amount of energy, focus on what they want. A documentation of education for all employees, documentation that employees have been trained following hiring, and documentation that employees have been trained after changing a procedure. And so if you're doing electrolytes using a certain method and you change those methods, they want to make sure that the existing personnel who are performing that new method actually have been trained on it. And so, you know, get the team together. I think one of the things that's important to do is to share the wealth. I think that no one person can do it alone. And I think sometimes we feel like we might need to do it alone because it's just everybody's so busy. And, you know, but if at all possible, it's just so important to get a team together and say, okay, this is what we're doing. And we're going to audit these 4 things because this is what the health department wants. And say, you know, team, what do you think about it? And just introduce it. And, you know, you may get some who are going to ask the detailed questions right up front. There's so many different types of people. And what I think is important to know is that we all go together to produce the best outcome if we utilize the intellect and the viewpoint of everybody on the team. And one of my, this would not be one of my first questions, but it would be one of Francine's first questions. She wants to know the details. Are we going to do all the items and all the employees? Then there's this person in the back, and you see him in the back, and I chose the one in the back because he's kind of trying to lay back saying, listen, I don't have any time. I mean, love to help, but I just not. And then there's this person say, yeah, I'll make a spreadsheet. So I think it's important to engage the team and really assess bandwidth when at all possible. So here's another polling question, and let's see. Can we go back? I want to go back. Yes, we can go back. Okay. The health department requires these 4 items: all lab personnel, documentation of education, training on hiring, and training on changing a procedure. Okay. Now I'll go back to the poll.
So which item below is least important to audit to be compliant for the inspection? I'll give you about a minute. Where are you going? Okay.
Yeah, great. And so what we have here is this one was a little bit more directed on my part to where I think that there would be probably one thing that if you're looking specifically at the inspection, what is the least important thing? And so the inspectors want to see a list of all laboratory technical personnel. They want to see education records. They want to see training. But they didn't say they wanted to see the documentation of counseling following errors. Now, is that important? Yeah, in my opinion, it's very, sorry, down arrow. I'm having a problem with my arrows.
You might need to just click it on the screen and then it should work again.
Thank you. Got it.
Yeah.
And so, but if you're really thinking in a very linear manner, what do they want? What do I have to do? They don't want to see counseling. So is it good to have it up to date? Absolutely. Is it good to have it intact and available? Absolutely, because this inspector may wander off the script, may wander off the checklist. But if you only have 10 minutes and you can only do 3 things in 10 minutes, just do what you're going to be evaluated on. So this is, you identify a roster of all lab technical personnel, and so this is the quality manager, and it looks complete, okay? You ought to have 100 technical personnel, and trust me, I'm making these numbers easy because math is not my long suit. So we're going with 100 technical personnel according to human resources, and you see 100 technical personnel. So basically, one of the important things that I think this also indicates is the ability and the importance of reaching outside the laboratory to engage others. Sometimes it's so easy just to stay focused in the lab and to say, I know what I have. But if for some reason, let's just say an inspector comes and they say, oh, let me match this up with HR records, and you don't match, it's kind of a little bit difficult. It seems disconnected. So it's good to engage human resources, good to engage your supervisor in this activity too, just to let them know what's going on. And so you meet with your team that you saw on the slide before, and collectively, as opposed to, do we have to audit all of them? You think, why don't we just audit 10%, because we only have a certain amount of time. And so if we audit 10%, and if we find problems, then we can audit more. But if we don't find problems, then probably everything is in pretty good shape. This is not prescriptive. It's a choice. You can do this in many ways. If you had enough people and enough time, auditing 100% is exactly what I do. In our lab, I can tell you we do audit 100%. Our personnel records at one point were very incomplete, if you will, and it is the constant auditing that has brought us into compliance. And so the team says, well, if we're only going to do 10%, then only one person is needed. And so that's the person who said, I'll do a spreadsheet. Sometimes those folks who are volunteering to do audits are the ones who are going to be your stars in the future, saying, yeah, I'll work a little bit extra because I think this is important and I can learn something doing this. And I'm also capable of doing it. It's a very important, that in an audit, that the people who do the audit, or the person who does the audit, is competent to know what that person is auditing. In other words, you wouldn't want to take someone who is not technical, non-technical, and have them audit a technical procedure in some way, because they don't have the knowledge base. So you've got to match the person auditing with what they're auditing from the standpoint of their knowledge base. And so this is the audit sheet. The results are shown on the next slide, and this is what you see. So you decide, okay, you're the manager. You said, okay, I've got a roster. It's all okay. So we're going to audit these three things. Is there education documentation? Is it present or absent? One of the important things to do in an audit is to be very, very clear about what you're auditing. I have seen audits before that don't specify exactly what you're auditing, so the person auditing thinks you're doing one thing, and the person receiving the information thinks you're doing another thing, and in the end, they don't match up. So you've got to be very specific. So what is education documentation? It's the school attended, the degree conferred, and the date of completion, okay? The initial training, present or absent, training items, date of completion, signature of preceptor and employee, training following changing of procedure, the same thing. And then who is the auditor? What is the date of the audit? And these are employee numbers. You would have them obviously be true employee numbers. And so what you notice here is that you've got some absent categories here, right here. And you can say that this education documentation is present, but the completion date may not be correct. And then here's one, you got the wrong person's information in the file. And if you go over to the training, which seems like it's really in good shape, this absent missed one test system. So this may be something to audit a little bit more on to see if we have any problems. So this may be someone who's doing 10 tests, and one of the tests somehow it didn't get documented that there was training on it. Maybe that person actually is a reasonably new hire. Maybe it's not time to have that training in the file at this point. Or maybe it was just missed. Maybe it was a changeover in management, which is oftentimes when you see things that are missed. Training following documentation, these guys didn't have any new procedures, so this all looks good. So you're looking at this and saying, we've got a problem. And so how do we deal with this? And so the initial audit shows that the area of concern relates to education documentation. Your next step is to take the next week to complete an audit on all technical employees, hoping that you will be done before the inspection. Engage more members of your team to help with an audit on all employees. Ask your supervisor for help. Hope that the health department doesn't look for education documentation. And there's no right answer, but think through it. And I don't think I have this. Yeah, I don't have this as a poll. I think there are a lot of ways to deal with this. I can tell you how I deal with it. First of all, I don't hope when it's an inspection. Inspections are real. It's hard reality. And I think the most important thing to do is if I see something like this, you say, there's something really wrong with this and not this, so what's the difference? And so I take it up the chain. I ask for help. I'd say, what's the difference here? And I would go to my supervisor and say, can you help explain this so we can troubleshoot it? Engage more members of the team. You know you've got a problem, you know? This would actually be this. I would not hope, and I would not hope. I would try to escalate as much as possible. And so share the results with your supervisor. And because you're new to the organization, okay, so the quality manager is new. So you're saying, I don't understand this. I've only been here 2 months. You ask for help understanding why some items are well documented, but one area is not. And your supervisor tells you that training is documented by the lab, but that education is documented by human resources. And so you say, I have no leverage over this. I have no ability to fix this. Your director engages human resources to do a complete audit of education documentation of employee records in the laboratory. And so I can tell you that something very similar happened to me at one point in my life with point of care testing. And the oftentimes laboratorians are very specific. We're very detailed. We're very careful. People outside the lab sometimes don't understand how highly regulated or how highly detailed we need to be or can be. And so sometimes what you see is if you don't have this uncovering of, oh, it doesn't matter about the education, you know, everybody's okay. And you may really run into problems with another department actually letting you down. And so that's where engaging your supervisor in a collaborative manner, letting human resources know that there's a big problem and that really we need to get this fixed. And so the follow-up is documentation of the current audit and corrective action, documentation from administration of completion of their audit gaps and action plans with dates. Sometimes this has to be escalated past the supervisor. Yes, I've seen that happen. Documentation of corrective action, adding the audit of personnel records of new employees going forward. Okay, and what you may want to do, so at this point, everything has been cleaned up. All the files are correct now per human resources. You may want to go back and audit some of those before the inspector shows up, just to make sure that they did what they said they were going to do. But also going forward, every time you get a new person on board, then you got to audit it and make sure we're still in compliance. And then feedback to administration to say, thanks so much, human resources. We appreciate your engagement on this. And then when the inspector comes, it's always great to have the person from human resources say, you know, bring them down or bring the inspector up and say, you know, we're so glad to partner on this together. Don't tell them that you had big problems unless they specifically ask. I mean, you have to be honest. But just say, you know, just want to know this is a shared thing and how much we appreciate working together. It's kind of the politics of being, I think, respectful. Maybe it's not politics. It's just showing mutual respect and appreciation for others who may not have the bandwidth to do this either. Okay, so this is an audit based on an identified problem. And this is a clinical lab. We're going to do one in the clinical lab. We're going to do one in the anatomic pathology lab. I can tell you I haven't had this specific issue come up with creatinine, but I've had things very similar happen. And so you're a supervisor of chemistry, and you get a call from a doctor taking care of a patient, and the patient has kidney disease, okay? And so the doctor orders a serum creatinine every month and got the results for the month of June yesterday. The patient looks okay, and the results are below, and the doctor questions the results. And so the expected, we use milligrams per deciliter in this country. This is micromoles per liter if you use that. I did put it in milligrams per deciliter because that's how I think, if you will, so I won't mess it up too much. And so March is, the patient had 1.3, so that's a little bit of renal insufficiency, you know, a little bit of renal disease, but it's not bad, 1.23, and then 5.35. And the doctor's saying, wow, this is really not consistent with what I'm seeing. This patient looks very well. And so of the choices below, what would you do first? Check to see if there is residual sample and repeat the sample. Check the creatinine quality. Oh, sorry, this is for you, Dr. Milner.
Oh, you're fine. You can read them, Beverly. I just want to make sure it launched. You're good. Go ahead.
Great. It's on. Check the creatinine quality control for yesterday. Rerun all the creatinine tests ordered yesterday. There were a total of 12. Or do an audit for the past month on the creatinine level. What will you do very first? Yeah, so again, I can't tell you that there's a right or a wrong answer here. I think in all of these things are something you would want to do. The question is, what do you do first? I would probably make the most of my time, and I would probably, as a supervisor, ask my tech, if I wasn't on the bench, I'd ask my tech, can you go see if there's a residual sample and repeat it? And then I would, in the meantime, be checking the creatinine quality control for yesterday. Rerunning all the creatinine tests, I think, is something that would be a valuable thing to do, depending on what you might see with the rerunning of the residual sample, or if you didn't have residual sample. You know, you may want to rerun some others to see how they are, and do an audit for the past month on creatinine level. I do think that's important, and I think we will probably get to that. Okay. So that's what I kind of just put those two as probably the first things I would do. And so this is what happened. The high-level quality control from yesterday was repeated two times before it would pass. One of the things that is not uncommon that I see is for technologists, particularly if you're busy, to really work very hard to get the QC to pass. And you really need to follow standardized rules, whatever those rules are, and to where if it doesn't pass, then you escalate to the supervisor or look into the instrument or something like that. Repeated 2 times, that may be within what's allowed, and it may not be. It just depends on your organization. The patient sample was repeated, and the result went from 5-point-something to 1.3. So basically, that's probably a spurious result from the day before, given the fact that it doesn't match what the doctor said, and it's now at 1.3, and that's consistent with the rest of the samples. All the patient samples for creatinine from yesterday, so then you repeated them all. and they were all less than 1.3. So anywhere from, 0.8, 0.5 to 1.29. You call the doctor to let her know that the result yesterday was spurious. And in addition to troubleshooting, you do an audit. And so you're looking at your audit to determine if this is isolated or if there have been other spuriously high values. And so this is what you get, and this is just an example. It's the past 59 to 60 days, or 60 results, not days. And so you look at this, and what you see is, you've got things that kind of run down where expected. You've got a spike. This is a little high, but you got a spike, a spike. So you're seeing this pattern of these spikes going up, and you're thinking, this kind of looks like the pattern of this patient where it was, within a reasonable range, and then all of a sudden it went out. And so you look to see if you have any samples left over. And I don't know what your individual labs do. I know that we try to save samples as long as we can. And for us in chemistry, I think it's either between 3 and 5 days. We save the plasma or the serum, or if it's a green top, then the green top itself. But basically, you have samples 8, 13, and 17. So you've got this one. You've got this one. It's 11. Actually, it's not projecting like I thought. It's kind of shifted. You've got these 3 samples. And so you're going to run these again, and this is what you see. And so essentially, this one that was 2 stayed about where it was, but these 2 came down. So basically what you're having is intermittent, very high creatinine levels. And so what are your next steps? 1, ask your lead tech to create an audit to assess creatinine levels every month. So at the end of the month, you're going to assess creatinine levels. Request that one of the specimen processors create the audit and monitor creatinine, as they have more time than your techs. Let your supervisor know that everything is okay for now, or take a vacation because you're exhausted by the instruments. Yeah, so let's keep an eye on it. You may want to audit monthly. You may want to do it weekly. And the better person, it is what you have to do is match the person auditing to what they're auditing. If the specimen processor is able to audit and interpret the creatinine, I think that's fine. But you really have to assess if that's the case. Ask your lead tech to create an audit is probably the most appropriate thing, given the fact that they're going to be looking at this data anyway. They need to know what's going on. Assess creatinine levels monthly. Maybe they want to do it weekly for a while. Maybe you want to repeat every level greater than 3. There are a lot of ways to address this. It's okay to let your supervisor know that everything is okay for now. And that's a very nebulous statement that I asked. Because, it is important to say, supervisor, we had a problem, we know what it is, we've communicated it, and we're troubleshooting. And so that's important to communicate up the chain as well. Take a vacation, I understand that. I've had these instruments, and you're just saying, gosh, please get me out of here. Yeah, and I think other things you would do is get the company in, look at your history on that instrument. You know that the QC has been high, and so get the company in to take a look at it and see if they can fix it. Because you look back in your maintenance records and maybe you see, they were out here 6 months ago for this same thing. And so, so I think it's important to create an audit and keep very close tabs on it. And so this is where we want to be, but anyway, we aren't there. Yes, so ask your tech to create an audit and assess the creatinine levels monthly. This is an example I just put in here at this point to show you just part of the audit policy that we have in our laboratory. Just to go over a little bit of it, but just to demonstrate how absolutely specific it is. The laboratory designee will use the audit schedule, and there's this defined schedule that is part of this policy at the end to determine what quality assurance checks should be included in the audit for that month. So some months we check maintenance, some months quality control to make sure it's been signed off on appropriately, etc. The audit worksheet will be utilized by the designee to ensure that the appropriate items are audited. It tells you you have to use this worksheet. That's a standardized way to do it. During the audit, the designee will note the date of the audit, initials, and corrective action if applicable. I can tell you that one of the things that's very interesting, we were just inspected by the College of American Pathologists, and one of the things that the inspectors or external auditors noted was that when we correct, this is just an aside, this doesn't have anything to do necessarily with number 3, but when we in our laboratory correct handwritten entries, we put a single mark through it and put our initials, but we had not universally put the date. And I actually hadn't universally done that either. We were cited for that, and we went back to the regulations, and sure enough, we should have been putting the date. So it's just really good to go to those regs and say exactly what I need. And you'll note here it says the date of the audit, initials, and corrective action. And so we're changing our lab general policy to say when you strike out on any sort of document, you need to put not only your initials, a single line, but also the date. Corrective action will be noted on the audit form and the completion date added once the corrective action has been completed. It is so important to close that loop. And it's hard to do because you have to keep it on some sort of list or you have to keep track of it. The designee should consider the findings from prior audits to determine trends. The auditor may add additional comments in the auditor comment section at the end of the form. And we're going to save the worksheet electronically in this online link. Corrective action documentation and updates should be added to the file until the file is complete. The audit records will be maintained for at least 2 years, and this is regulatory for us, and may be referenced at any time to confirm trends. And then where is your point of letting your director know, letting your medical director know what the audits show? They'll be reviewed by the core lab section director, and this is for core lab. Signatures will be captured electronically, how it's going to be done, and process improvements will be initiated as appropriate. So this very specific delineation of how we audit was actually put into effect 4 years ago in our laboratory. And we actually revamped our quality governance system, and it really breathed new life into our quality program. This is just one of our audit sheets that we use. This is for calibration, and we audit this in February, May, August, and November. It says that the records were reviewed, the documented and reviewed, instrument, the eye-to-eye, instrument-to-instrument was reviewed. Linearities are okay, and records are reviewed for acceptability and include pre- and post-verification. Now, this is the type of thing you could give it to a technologist. You could not give it to someone who wasn't technical and expect them to complete it. So it really depends on what you're auditing when you choose the person who's going to do the audit. And so here's the anatomic lab, and I have to tell you, this really happened. And this was, we had problems for probably a year. And during that year, we had a changeover in leadership, changeover in technologists. It wasn't it wasn't a great time for our histology. And I'm an anatomic pathologist as well. So when I look through a microscope and I don't get the quality of section I need, I get really stressed because I know that I have to make a diagnosis on a suboptimal specimen, and I don't want to cause a patient harm. And so you're the supervisor of histology. A pathologist comes to you because the H&E, that's hematoxylin and eosin, for those of you who aren't anatomic focused. But this is just the basic pathology stain. It's very pale on the GI biopsies today. The pathologist said he thinks it's been happening lately, but isn't sure. This is absolutely classic. Pathologists, we don't notice details, technical details often. We just know when we can't diagnose something easily. There's an occasional pathologist who is that detailed. They'll say, you know, you've got a wrinkle on this today. I won't see it unless it impairs my ability to make a diagnosis. But this is actually, I asked our current histotech supervisor who was new during this time and actually helped figure some of this out. And I asked her, I said, do you remember that time when we had the bad H&Es, the pale staining? She goes, oh yeah, I remember it. And there was more than one reason found, but this was one of the reasons that I'm going to share with you today. And so the pathologist says, well, will you just look into it? And so this is from the time that I'm talking about in our lab. This is what the H&E should have looked like. This is a biopsy of colon. These are red blood cells in here, and these right here, if you can see them, these little stippled orange things, those are Paneth cells, and so it's probably small intestine or some sort of diseased colon, or maybe ascending colon, and then there are some eosinophils in here somewhere, like up here. But this is what we were getting, and I'm sitting there and I look at it and I think, I don't know. If there are eosinophils, I can't see the Paneth cells. And so it was really impairing our ability, and we'd have to have things cut again, and it was just very difficult. You can tell from the stress in my voice how hard it was. It was really hard. And so this is one of those. There may not be a perfect answer for this one either, but love to get your thoughts. And so, you know, you're the supervisor. You're saying, okay, so this pathologist comes to me and says, you know, these are too pale. And I think this isn't the first time, but I'm not really sure. And so, you know, what might you do? Call the manufacturer of the hematoxylin. Hematoxylin is the purple stain to determine if there's a problem with their reagents. So you're assuming the problem is hematoxylin. Set up and that's what your pathologist might assume. I certainly did. Set up an audit to review the slides to assess the H&E stain 1 day a month for 6 months. And so that's going forward. And so you're looking at it 1 day a month. Counsel your histology tech about making sure the stain is not pale, or pull the slides from the previous week to assess the stain to get more information, because the pathologist isn't quite sure. Okay, and so pulling the slides from the previous week, it seems to be the favorite. It's certainly a way to get more documentation. You don't know if this happens every week, but at least you can say, well, let me see what this looks like. Setting up the audit, setting up an audit is a good idea. If you're thinking if it's 1 day a month for 6 months, and the pathologist says, I'm not sure how often this happens. I think the question would be, is it going to be successful? And I don't know. Trust me, we did call the manufacturer the hematoxylin because the pathologist said it's got to be the hematoxylin. And as far as counseling the histology tech, I think it depends on whether you think that that there may be a problem with the staining. There's counseling, or you could also go in and say, hey, how'd you do that stain? And I think that's, you know, that's certainly appropriate just to say, we got a problem with the stain. It's kind of engaging your staff and say, can you help us think through this? Is there anything different? I would pull the slides from the previous week. I'd probably call the manufacturer. I just like to call people, say, have you seen this? But really getting data is probably the best thing you can do. And so the slides from the previous week look fine. And you're thinking, okay. So you troubleshoot the staining for the day the pathologist indicated the problem, and you can't identify an issue with the hematoxylin. So you do some experiments. Is the hematoxylin bad? You say, it doesn't look like it's the hematoxylin. And you watch the histotech, okay, do a stain, and it's done appropriately. And so the next step could be all accept. Call your friends at other hospitals to see if they've had trouble. Ask the pathologist if he would document on a form for the next month when he sees pale staining. Perform direct observation of all employees that do an H&E stain, or talk to your supervisor about buying an automated H&E stainer. The step is any except. Remember that word, except. So what's the one thing you probably wouldn't want to do first? Even though your pathologist may ask you to do it. Yeah, that's interesting. That is interesting. One thing you wouldn't want to do. So that's what I can say is that I'll just talk through it. And again, there's no right answer. Call your friends. I love calling friends. Any trouble with the hematoxylin? But again, you're assuming it's hematoxylin. And it may be because your pathologist is saying the hematoxylin's pale. That was me. Ask the pathologist if you document on a form. Now, some may say, oh, of course I will, and some may say, you've got to be joking. And so, but I would hope that the pathologist would be a partner in this. And if not, it may fall to the supervisor to document him or herself. Perform direct observation of all employees. That's probably one of the first things I go to. Is if I have a new problem, I perform direct observation and just say, what does it look like? Talk to your supervisor about buying an automated H&E stainer. And so that's actually the thing that that we as pathologists said. I think we had an automated stainer, but we said it's got to be the stainer. You got to get a new stainer. You got to do this, do that. And so that from my standpoint. Well, I think we're. Can I close? Oh, good. And so I think if we went to our administrator about buying an H&E stainer because the pathologist said the staining wasn't good, I think that would be good. And so what have you done to look into this? And that was just kind of my thought about at least how it would flow at our place. We have to justify it. So what you have to do is look at things scientifically, hopefully engage your pathologist, hopefully engage the entire value stream and try to figure out what's going on. And then if it keeps going on, then you might want to spend some money on an automated stainer. And so the pathologist says, of course I'll help you, and so keeps track of the staining. And so G is good and P is pale. Okay, so this is Monday, good, Tuesday, good, etc. And on Thursday, it's pale. Well, on the next Thursday, it's good. This one and this one is pale. And so this is where you go to, okay, so what's happening on this Thursday? And if you think about it, if you're thinking about the value stream, again, in anatomic pathology and also in clinical pathology, because you do have specimens being sent to laboratories often, specimens that are drawn, you may have short draws, you may have specimens that got too hot. But in anatomic pathology, you've got biopsies, and you have a biopsy that was put in, hopefully formalin, if you use formalin, but sometimes it like gets diluted. Sometimes it doesn't get put in formalin really quickly. Sometimes on the transport, it doesn't go really well. Everything leaks. And so there's a whole lot of pre-analytic that goes on in the anatomic pathology world. And so what you do is you think about, let me look at this whole value stream. And this is about, including your folks outside the laboratory. This is where all those relationships make a big difference. And so I would suggest in this scenario, we aren't worried about the test selection. We worry about how the sample was collected, how it was transported, and how it was prepared. We know that the report isn't the problem here. It's somewhere here in the value stream. And so you call the manager of the GI clinic where you get samples from. Every other Wednesday is the busiest biopsy day, and it was a GI biopsy that the pathologist was complaining about. And so every other Wednesday is the busiest biopsy day, and those Wednesdays happen to be these days right here. And so you ask the manager of the GI clinic to investigate whether there's anything unusual about these Wednesdays. Is there a different fixative? Is there a different patient preparation, with the bowel prep? These are our friendly gastroenterologists. We see these guys all the time down in pathology wanting to look at the biopsies. And so you just say, is there anything different going on these Wednesdays compared to other days when we just get a few biopsies from you? And then you focus on processes in the laboratory because basically they say, no, there's really nothing different. And what you notice is that there's a PRN histotech, and that's just as needed, somebody who comes in when you really need it, who works every other Thursday to support the volume from the GI clinic. And so you're thinking, I bet this has something to do with it. And so in order for this person to work, she uses a microtome, and the microtome is what you cut sections on that is not used otherwise. It's one of those sitting at the back that you couldn't throw away, but it's really not a great microtome. And she uses the same staining solution that the other histotech uses, who's there every day. You don't know if she does it exactly the same. And when you did your direct observation in the lab initially, she may not have been there. So you have to really think, maybe this is a difference. And so the next step for the supervisor could be any of the following, except, now for the poll. Oh, do you have a poll, Dr. Milner? Oh, there it is. And you could perform direct observation for cutting the block and staining the slide for the histotech who works every other Thursday. So you're just looking at her work. And remember, this is any of the following except. Have engineering come evaluate the cryostat. Have your primary histotech cut a biopsy on the microtome the PRN histotech uses. So have that histotech who's cutting on the routine microtome go over to the other one and say, how does this cut for you? And discard and refresh the hematoxylin before use on the Thursday in question. So you're still thinking, I think it's the hematoxylin. Which one of these would you not do first? Yeah, you know what I chose, and it completely depends. I think it does depend on your operation. I said have engineering come evaluate. That's the microtome instead of the cryostat. I got that wrong. It's the microtome. If we had engineering come up and say, can you evaluate this microtome? I think they would say, and what do you want us to evaluate? It's kind of, sometimes you just want help. And you want help from maybe an engineer, but I think sometimes it's really useful to do other things first. And so that wouldn't be my first choice. My first choice is just to try to do some more troubleshooting so that we make the use of everybody's time. And so The engineer is crying because he's saying, I don't have time to go evaluate well, not cryostat, the microtome. And so what you do, and trust me, this took, as I said, a year. You identify that the GI biopsies with the pale staining are only cut on the microtome used by the PRN histotech because your other histotech came over, cut some, and they were still pale. And you look further into the cut sections, you realize there are thick sections and thin sections. It's called cutting thick and thin, and that the thin sections don't stain well. You engage engineering at that point to say, it's cutting thick and thin. Can you fix this? And they come and fix it, and all is well, and your pathologists are ecstatic because now they can do their job. I think an audit for critical regulations is a type of audit that should be standard in every laboratory, and you have to figure out which critical regulations you want to audit. And so one of the things that that I think is important is to, number one, determine what outside agencies are concerned about. And once again, it could be a health department, it could be a safety office, a national safety office. But it's important to know what is important to those who might inspect you, because sometimes it's not just because you're getting inspected, it's because they reach a top level of concern for a good reason. And there may be some things that you yourself have noticed that are very concerning that you want to continue to audit. And so this is a scenario where a mandate was delivered to address working conditions at healthcare facilities in the country. Okay, employee accidents was identified as a key area of concern. And I can tell you on our scorecard here, employee accidents are on every department, every section of the laboratory, on every scorecard. We keep track of it very closely. So you create an audit to determine if your employees are at risk for accidents. You might audit the sharps containers are not empty, but removed and replaced at appropriate times. That when there we go. Okay, thank you. Good job. Okay. Audit for critical regulations. I think it's important. Anything that's a critical regulation often translates to administration, whereas your QC on creatinine may just leave some blank stares back at you. If you're saying, you know, we're concerned about patient employee safety, that will resonate. So I think going to the boardroom, saying we want to really engage everyone to be involved in this. Again, working with your stakeholders, those who are responsible for ensuring there is safety, making sure these signs are up. Use a problem-solving team, investigate the root causes, develop appropriate corrective action. And then once you investigate the root causes, which is, to me, that is the most important, one of the most important parts of any sort of problem-solving exercise. And what I can share is that very often I see people get down about halfway, but they don't get down to the root cause. And until we get to the root cause, problems will keep coming back. We implement what's called the 5 whys, and I do that all the time. You know, an employee fell on a wet floor. Why? There wasn't a sign. Why? The housekeeping person mopped the floor and didn't put up the sign. Why? Well, there aren't any signs. Well, okay. You know, so why aren't there signs? You know, let's get some signs. So it's so important, I think, before assuming that I think everybody comes into work in the morning wanting to do a good job, and particularly, you know, we take care of patients, and in every interaction, in every mistake, in every error, my first question is, what in the process, what in the system didn't support this person to do a good job? And I think engaging and that mutual respect is so important when issues are uncovered. It's important, obviously, to implement corrective action and look at the effectiveness of that corrective action. Record all the actions and findings. If it's not documented, it didn't happen. That is a classic inspection tenet. If it's not documented, it didn't happen. And then monitor, continue to audit. Audit should lead to action. Audit, identify the opportunity for improvement. You've seen this slide before. Once identified, take action. It's easy to get overwhelmed. It's necessary to prioritize. And once you do, take action, document the action, make sure it's effective, and then continue to audit. You may want to change your audits. If you have audits that are clean for a full 6 months, you may want to say, okay, and you audit every month, you may want to say, okay, I'm going to audit every 3 months for a while. And then it's important to keep audits as living documents. Things that are absolutely critical, you may want to keep them forever. Don't change them. But audits that are used to address identified issues, keep that audit until the issue is no longer an issue, and then decrease that audit frequency, and eventually you may not audit that anymore. This is something that I just wanted to share because it came across my desk probably about 3 or 4 weeks ago. This is from one of our supervisors. We were preparing for an inspection, and I had modified enough to where it won't be transparent what was happening, but there were logs that were missing. And this is make sure a change to fix a problem is sustained, and that's really one great use of an audit. And so when we identify a problem, we use what's called an SBAR format, situation, background, assessment, and recommendations. And we are implementing this more and more. Our quality manager, Kevin Wickware, basically what we were doing was we were doing audits. We were actually having suggestions from the staff about ways to improve quality, and we would make changes, but then we wouldn't hardwire and make sure those changes were sustained. So what we did was implement this format to not only explain issues when they are found, but also to determine if a fix is maintained. But this was actually an issue, and this is what came across the email from the supervisor. And this was essentially to the core lab medical director, but I was copied because I'm the CLIA holder. The 2018 logs are missing. Okay, so we're being inspected. Now, you don't want to have, this is in preparation for an inspection, you don't want to have missing logs. That's kind of like the worst thing is to have missing data background. In May of 2020, the supervisor discovered that these logs were missing, and that was in preparation for an inspection. Standard processes for the supervisor or staff, you see this right here, supervisor or staff, that's one problem. If it's not clear who's supposed to do something, sometimes it just doesn't get done. To move the old logs from the binder into the supervisor's office for 2-year retention. So this is all on paper. Assessment. Supervisor searched for these logs in the binder, file cabinets, office, spent a lot of time, she didn't find them. She interviewed the staff about where could they be, no one recalls it. We've had some changeover in supervisors during this time. The documents most likely were discarded inadvertently with other documents that are discarded after 30 days. Okay, the supervisor reported the missing logs to the director, which is the director of clinical pathology, who recommended using the 2018 clinical engineering records to show that these things, these pieces of equipment, which were functioning properly. That was good. So engineering backs us up, and that's good. We also do additional checks, but at least this is documentation. And so going forward, copies from clinical engineering were added to the files. Going forward, the files for the current year will be retained in the binder. Each month after the supervisor reviews the log, the supervisor will save an electronic copy of the signed log. So this is really just hardwiring it. For 2018, there was no downtime for these instruments, nor were there any incidents. So we aren't worried about the patient care, but we are worried about the fact that we had a loose system, and we tightened it up. So from the director of clinical pathology back to the supervisor and all those who were on the email, which includes probably about 5 to 6 people involved in this, this is what she said, and I really appreciated this. This looks like something that needs to be added to the laboratory audit policy. We didn't audit. Why? Because they were in a non-technical area of the laboratory, and so we missed it. And we would audit in a technical area, but we forgot about the non-technical. The laboratory audit policy generally works well, and it says currently the lab audit policy requires monthly audits and encompasses all of the technical areas of the lab, but doesn't specifically include non-technical areas. To the manager, we need to add a required audit, perhaps every 3 months. This is not directive from the medical director, it's engaging. And this is one thing I very much appreciate her. Her name's Elizabeth Weinzierl. And perhaps every 3 months, but you know, for the non-technical areas, it would entail, and now get very specific, centrifuge checks that aren't covered. Oh, you found out what it was. Okay, by the technical area audit policy already. Obviously, there's a gap here. Temperature checks that aren't covered by the technical area audit policy, employee records. And then she asked for an opinion. Anything else, you know? And so this is, I think, the best way to run the laboratory. It's engaging those who are closer to the action, providing direction, but providing an opportunity for input. The laboratory audit policy also requires that these documents are uploaded to the P drive, and this is electronic documentation at the time of audit. But we didn't do that to the specimen processing area. And this is one of the forms that I was talking about. The name of the monitor. This is how we go ahead and ensure that we have hard wiring. The ID Now contamination. There was a contamination of an instrument we used for infectious disease testing. There was an assessment done in November 2020 with an SBAR. Corrective action was the contamination issues reported for this organism, and this organism concerning this instrument serial number. Strep A resulted in 2 invalid results for the instrument, and influenza A was positive for the instrument. Laboratory testing personnel followed this contamination wipe test, corrective action. So sometimes with these kind of amplification tests, which is what these are, you can get contamination, so you really need to deal with it. The strep issue was resolved. The influenza instrument continued to report positive for flu A. They couldn't get it under control, and so we took it out of commission, contacted the supervisor, cleaned it again, and finally got it clean. But this is to follow up on an SBAR that highlighted the issue, and basically was the corrective action productive? Yes. Did it address it? Is it sustainable? Has it improved performance? And so this is just something else that we've recently implemented to try to hardwire these activities. And so I would just leave you with continuous monitoring is the key element to success in the quality system. This came as part of our slides from for these audit lectures or talks. I think it's absolutely important. Every lab should be always inspection ready. We should never prepare for an inspection. And we should just absolutely have the inspectors walk in at any time. You can tell that my laboratory isn't completely there yet because I did say we discovered something while preparing for an inspection. But it is my goal to be always inspection ready or as close to it as we can, and audits form the very firm foundation of ensuring that this occurs. So I believe that is my last slide, and happy to know where to go from here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Beverly. This has been really helpful. I think these are great examples of assessment and audit cases. We had one specific question about one of the cases, and I apologize we didn't pause quick enough to ask it, but I will just ask it now and you can go back to it. So which is preferred for your creatinine case, which is preferred when such is happening like the creatinine test? Do you either check the QC the day that the error test performed or repeat the test from the remaining sample? In other words, I think they're asking, what would be your first gut reaction? Would you check the QC or would you repeat the test?
It's a good question. And I can't, I know what I would do, which is repeat the test, but I would do it at the same time. That to me, they're synonymous. It's just the first logical thing you do is repeat the sample and check the QC. And I don't think I would do either one first.
Great.
I would do them with two people at the same time.
Great. So if anyone has any other questions that they want to ask about any of the presentations or about audits or assessments in general, please put those in the Q&A now. I just have one question, which is, a lot of what you've talked about today, Beverly, was around, finding errors and then going back and doing audits or preparing for an external assessment and trying to figure out what are they going to look at? Because, can we really cover everything? And I think what you're really striking at or kind of getting to, around the idea of is that, when you want to be an accredited laboratory, there's often a checklist or there's a tracking process or a tracing process or some other set of standards that are there. And what's on that checklist is often everything, right? It's like every possible thing. And so when you're going to potentially be audited by your accreditor, you kind of have to have everything prepared. But when you have a spot audit, as kind of what you were describing, where someone's going to come in and just look at one thing or one piece, you were suggesting you need to try to focus and figure that out. But can you comment on the flip side of all of this, which is keeping good personnel records, documenting that people were counseled and that errors were done correctly, or making notes to say that, oh, I corrected this day, here are my initials and our date. How is that creating quality for a patient outside of being assessed, outside of accreditation, et cetera? How does that represent just good laboratory practice and good, things that we should be doing anyway so that the patients are getting the best care?
It is so important to, and it goes back to what I said, and I said what I meant, follow your policies and procedures. Laboratories are so detailed and also so complex, it's called detailed complexity, that we have to have specific procedures to make sure we produce the correct results. And there's the substance of producing the correct results is having people who are competent on the bench, looking at the results, comparing them with previous results, using intellect to get to where you need to be. And if you have a personnel, and heaven knows, I've had my share of counseling, and the first thought is what in the system really produced a system to where you failed. You can learn from that. And so what you can do is they say, well, but when I get these samples, they all come down at 4 a.m. and I can't do them all at the same time. And so that's why I'm late on my turnaround time. And so you say, well, let me talk to the floors and see if they can get their samples down at 2, 3, and 4 a.m. So we can make this more of a level process. That type of identification of an issue and counseling or identifying and potentially counseling an employee allows the doctors to get their results back on time so that when they go to rounds at 6 a.m., they actually have their results on their patients. And so, that type of thing is so important to uncover the issues. But the other flip side of that coin is that there may be people who very consistently don't perform up to speed. They may be in the wrong position. They may not be able to. And so if you don't document the quality issue, And if it does seem to be isolated to a person, then say, listen, we've had 3 instances where you haven't called back a critical result. And when you didn't call back a critical result this last time, the patient was actually sent home and had a positive blood culture, and we had to bring that patient back. And that patient almost died. You can't allow that type of behavior to continue. So maybe there's a better location, or maybe this just isn't going to work out. At the end of it, the patient is everything we do. And if you have functional systems, they support us turning around lab tests that are accurate and timely. And if they aren't accurate and timely, if you get or if they're of suboptimal quality, let's just say you can't see the eosinophils in a biopsy of the esophagus. You may have a patient who has a severe disease called reflux, to where they have so much heartburn and they don't get treated because the biopsy says no, everything's normal. Well, it's not normal, not if you have the appropriate staining. So it's very important.
Great. So in addition, we have a couple of questions that came in. So on that same theme, how does one go about internal audits for histological diagnosis in anatomic pathology?
I think that we very flush there. You have to probably review cases, I think is the best way to do it. You can use clinician concerns, et cetera. But if you're using clinician concerns saying that Dr. A kind of got this one wrong, you don't want to find out that way. You'd rather find out before that happens. We engage several mechanisms. One is, again, if you have one pathologist, it can get a little bit difficult. And I would recommend that pathologist send a certain number of slides, if possible, to another place and have them reviewed by a second person who is a good pathologist, and maybe do an exchange that way, review each other's cases. Another way is, we have a group here, and so what we do is every other Wednesday, we review all the frozen section diagnoses of the previous month. And frozen sections, for those of you who are focused on lab and not path, is the immediate response to the surgeon about whether he or she has a tumor in the operating room. It's a very critical thing to get right. And so when we do that, we review everyone's work on this critical diagnosis. And so if somebody's not doing well. The other thing we do is a slide review. We just the transcriptionist pull slides of Dr. A, and Dr. B looks at 25 cases and says, do I agree or do I not? And then I actually review autopsies where I look at reports, slides, et cetera. So it's also important, I think, to think of the value stream. That's kind of internal. But it's also important to ask your clinicians. If they're volunteering that you've got a problem, that's a problem. But going to your gastroenterologist and saying, hey, how have our reads been? How is your turnaround time? Are you getting your reports? Those are the kinds of things that is also important to do to make sure that the work you're doing actually gets to the right place and has an effect.
Thanks. And I think that's exactly right. Internal audits are exactly what you said. They're internal, and so they're of your own design. And as long as they are consistent and demonstrating that the laboratory is checking the work of others, they're usually okay to find errors and find problems. I think one of the sort of the caveats to that whole process is that in the United States, at least, when you have an NCI designated comprehensive cancer center, these are centers outside of the NIH, like Harvard or Yale, et cetera, that have been designated by the NIH as a comprehensive cancer center. One of the metrics that they use to determine that cancer center is superior is how often they change the diagnoses of people from the outside. So let's say a patient is diagnosed in a community hospital with a cancer, and then they go to the Dana-Farber in Boston for their therapy, and it has to be reviewed by pathology. And the metric of how often the Brigham changes that outside diagnosis in minor or major ways is a metric of the quality of that cancer care. So when you have the NIH has the entire spectrum cancer care at a cancer center to decide, how you talk about quality, their metric that they settled on was an audit, right? Literally an audit of diagnostics. So it is really important, and having a way to capture that within your program is really crucial. Here's another question. If the health department was being invited for audit, would you not have indicated what you want audited? And I think what they're asking, Beverly, is if you're asking them to come in and do an audit, wouldn't you say, please audit this? But I think what you were describing was if they're coming in, but you didn't request them to come in, right? So can you comment on like an invited audit versus an uninvited audit?
Yeah, thank you. And indeed, the one I gave was uninvited. Although, even if it's uninvited, it should be welcome, because, although it's stressful, but it should be welcome because it helps us be better and it helps us benchmark. An invited audit, yes, I use the term consultant for that, and I have in my career used consultants in probably a couple of different ways. And one way I use a consultant is if I do think I've got a problem in an area, and I might say, would you look at these things? And so, yes, I might define what I'd like them to look at. But usually, if I'm to the point where I want a consultant to come in, I'm usually asking for help and saying, tell me what I don't know, because I'm worried enough. And I've had that type of audit as well, invited audit. The other thing I think that's useful is to have audits done by, and this is in some of the literature I think that was provided in previous lectures. Try your best not to have the person who is responsible for the data actually auditing their own data. In any way, try to avoid that. And so I think that when you're auditing, if you're auditing departments for, let's just say compliance for maintenance documentation, do the best to have somebody outside that department do that audit. And what I have received when I have requested that, and I request that, I have done that for my entire career, and I always receive the same thing about, but they don't know the department. And I said, that's a good thing. If we're organized enough, and if we have things in the right place, you shouldn't have to know the department. It might take a little bit more time to introduce them. This is where we keep our materials. But it's really great to have those fresh eyes. So I use that all the time.
Great. And then we have one more question. Is there a standardized, this is a great final question, is there a standardized or universal checklist for audits for laboratories?
I don't know. Dr. Milner, any idea?
Well, I think that's why it's such a great question, because if after we take the time to pull together this course and we talk about this, et cetera, do we have an international standard for that? And I think you can point to things like ISO accreditation and the different checkpoints that they have on there. You can point to CAP accreditation from the US point of view. There's SONIS in South Africa, which does a lot of African places. So there are many different types of external auditors who have their checklist, their audits, et cetera, which I would say are interesting in that if you look, for example, at the college's checklist, it's largely related to some degree in products that they offer, and which is interesting, right? It's a kind of a circle of creating the need to do something, and then they supply that need. So it's a really great business model. But outside of that, if you look at ISO, like there's no one, selling ISO related things. There's just the ISO accreditation that you can get. So it begs the question of in a global setting, like if you're trying to say any lab anywhere in the world for chemistry should be doing all of the following, kind of things. I don't think that list exists, because someone either needs to monetize it to make it valuable, to create the list, to utilize the list. Whereas so in other words, let's take a lab in Zambia. Some of you are probably from Zambia. Let's take a lab in Zambia where currently there's no government requirement necessarily for the labs to have external quality assurance for histopathology, right? So let's just assume that that may not be true, but we're going to take a hypothetical. If there's no mandate for those labs to have external quality assurance, and they're all government labs, for example, so that having accreditation for or having EQA for anatomic pathology isn't generating any competitive advantage for that laboratory, why would anyone generate a list of standards that was helpful for Zambia, right? And that's just a kind of a silly capitalist argument. But if you step back from that, you can say, okay, there should be, right? There should be this Uber list of like what we should be doing. And ultimately what it comes down to, in my opinion, and Beverly, you can disagree with me, are SOPs, right? So SOPs should be universal. We should have an SOP, standard operating procedure for how we, gross in certain specimens, how we, perform tissue processing, how we do each, and every lab has to have their own SOP, which is adapted to their format. And at the end of the day, if you're always following SOPs and doing everything correctly, then the amount of error that can happen is very low. And if someone comes in to audit you, even if you've never heard of them before, if you're following all your SOPs across all of your procedures, where is the issue? How are you going to have a problem? Well, the problem is going to come in with human error or, reagent error. You're going to find errors because things will happen and you'll get there. And that's why audits are important, internal audits and external audits, to say, you've got a system, you've got SOPs, which is our best way to ensure that a laboratory functions correctly in whatever they're doing. But still, how do we make sure we still aren't making errors, right? And that's the value of audits, both internal and external. The question is, how do you, for lack of a better word, monetize that process so that people actually want to do it? Like, how do we get a company or a third party or even the government, of say a region of Africa to come together and say, you know what, external quality assurance for histology is really important. And that would then mandate that internal quality assurance and internal audits and internal assessments are important because you have to be prepared for those external audits. So there is a systematic need for it to be there in order for such a list that you're asking for to exist. But in truth, if your laboratory is basing its operations entirely on SOPs for everything that it does, and you can see some things, and I'm sure Beverly can tell you about them, that are on checklists that you're like, well, how would that be part of an SOP, right? There are sometimes items that are very hard to understand why they're on these lists, but at the end of the day, if it's on a checklist, it should be related to production of a highest quality lab result, and therefore it should be captured in an SOP. I don't know, Beverly, if you have a difference of opinion on that.
Yeah, thanks so much. No, I do, and I appreciate you bringing up the standard operating procedures, because those are the rules we live by, and they're based on our mission to take the best care of the patient, and to provide quality and timely results. And so I think that it's absolutely true. You go back to your standard operating procedures. I've been in, and so then the question is, well, are there standard SOPs? And I've been in situations before, moving from one place to another, one job to another, where I've actually reached out to the place where I came from and said, we just really need help. And I would get, 25 SOPs sent to me saying, please just go ahead and use them. I think that things like, and so I think asking for help is important, but everything, even our SOPs, need to be focused on just doing an excellent job. And if our SOPs aren't good, and even yesterday, in one of my areas of the laboratory, which I think needs to improve their SOPs, and there's a reason that area lagged, but I review them. And I looked at it and I said, this is unclear. And so I sent it back to the supervisors and I said, this is the reason this is unclear, please. And so you've got to have clarity in your SOPs in order to support the frontline people doing their job well. And I think it's so important to have SOPs, have them be good, and then audit based on what we say we're supposed to be doing. I wish, there's also something, I think there's something just that it's different from place to place. And so it's hard to have something that is standardized. And I wish there were, but I think lab medicine is so complex that that's hard. It's just hard to do. But I would suggest that, you know, if you learn something in a day, share it with others. You know, it's the way I go. And I've tried to include just a few things from my lab in here too. Just we're all a community. So so I think getting help and not being afraid to ask for it is important.
Agree. And I do think that, you know, the other concept, and I think someone else will talk about this in detail, but the other concept is that SOPs are dynamic living documents, right? They aren't fixed in stone. They aren't, you know, perfect. And in fact, and I know that this happened in our laboratory when I was in Boston, you would have an assay that you have an SOP for, and the manufacturer would make a change in the reagents or the process, and your SOP may not be updated for 6 months or a year, even though you have to immediately start doing that. And that's not really, you know, the right approach. Like when you change an SOP, or you change the way you do something with the new reagent, the first thing you should do is like, okay, we have to rewrite the SOP. And then we have to clear that with everyone who's going to use this assay so that everyone is clear on the technique. And what we would find is that we would have problems when that didn't happen. Like if we switched to a new assay and that whole process wasn't completed, then you would start having issues with the lab. And so I think the idea that an SOP is just like you write one and it just sits there on a shelf forever is not true. And an SOP is a living document, as you just said, that you have to check every once in a while to make sure it's still consistent with the plasticware you're buying, with the, you know, the schedule of delivery that you get, with the clinical needs, you know, of the clinicians, of when you report them out and the time of day that you do them, and all that sort of stuff becomes, it is very complex. And I'm not saying all that to be overwhelming to the group, but what I'm suggesting is that having really good SOPs is not it's not something that you do and put on a shelf so that if you get audited, you have really good SOPs so that you can do really good work for your patients. And that's your guide and your safety net for how you're supposed to do this. And you're constantly checking it and doing that. And so that's why my point was, if you have really good SOPs as a framework, then you shouldn't be afraid of an audit, right? I mean, and so it's all about, you know, picking and choosing your battles to how to do that. So Beverly, we don't have any more questions. I just want to say thank you so much. These were really wonderful illustrative cases, and thank you for taking the time to do that. Just a reminder to everyone, the recording for this will be available within the next 24 hours, and it will be on the landing page. It will replace the registration link as just a link directly to the Zoom, the completely recorded Zoom. And all of those other previous sessions are also recorded and available. And if you have people who didn't get to register, you can still access them. They're basically publicly available now. So thank you. And with that, I'm going to close it out and say goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.